Welcome to this very important conversation on issue that has vexed many societies and governments around the world. By way of opening remarks, let me just try and give you my thought on what we are trying to discuss today. I think in this digital age, we are fundamentally negotiating 4 new contracts. I think the social contract of the 19th century are up for revision. When we talk about the data policies, data protection bills, and security, surveillance, capitalism, etc., we are essentially now negotiating a new arrangement between the state and the industry. And how do you manage this particular relationship? The industry and the users. What is the fundamental ethic that should drive this particular engagement? The government and the citizens. And what are the new levers of responsibilities and controls? And finally, the user and the citizen, as we can now see that users themselves are becoming organizers and drivers of social media outcomes. So whether it's the horrible cases of certain mediums being used to create violence and disturbances, or to create aggregations that can create positive change, we are seeing the users and citizens create their own engagement. So I think this new social arrangement, this new social contract is really what we are discussing. We have an interesting panel to discuss all of this. We have Rahul Mathan, who has been writing, and he's a new book out on this particular subject. He's a lawyer who understands this whole sector quite intimately. We have Argo Sengupta, who has been driving this Indian proposition. The Shri Krishna committee member, as well as the person who has personally invested a lot of time for India to put forward a sensible framework. We have Rob Sherman, who is suffering in Europe, suffering in California, and now will suffer in India, and he will tell us whether the suffering is the same or different. We have Mr. Gopalakrishnan, who will finally sign what Orgo has been agitating in the committee, although he says no, but he's part of the government. And let's say that his ministry has been the principal actor in putting forward this proposition that we are discussing and debating today, and eventually it will be discussed in Parliament as well. And finally, we have the former NSA of the United States, General Hayden, who has, in many ways, as I was telling my panelists, a curious distinction of being an NSA who wanted encryption, who was comfortable with going dark, who was not necessarily so interested in having back doors, windows, and front doors, because he intrinsically understood the sanctity of the system is retained when the system remains, has a degree of integrity. So, Mr. Hayden, let me start with you, General Hayden. Coming from where you do, is security a false flag to redesign some of the systems that should primarily serve innovation and personal rights in spaces? And coming from the country that you do you think we have, A, not been able to create a system that offers the same levels of legal protections to all citizens across the world? The US does well to protect its own citizens, but doesn't do so well to protect me. My data is up for grabs. The US citizen is protected. And 2, the US has not done very well in being able to create data exchange agreements with countries, which has led to a certain degree of pushback around data localization, around countries coming up with their own legal frameworks, and perhaps the GDPR and the Indian protection bill, data protection bill, have that degree of cynicism around US policy as well.
If I bring up the question of the San Bernardino terrorist killings about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit more, recall terrible killing, dozens killed, and then a great fight over a cell phone as to whether or not the FBI should direct Apple to bust through the iOS in order to read the data on the phone. It seemed to be a clear question of security and privacy. It might surprise you that me and a whole bunch of Americans like me, and by like me, I mean really like me, former directors of the National Security Agency, sided with Apple, sided with the company against law enforcement, not out of privacy rights. The individual who owned the phone was dead. He didn't have any privacy rights. And not out of business concerns. We didn't have interest in the success of Apple. in this incredibly complex world, we sided with Apple in a way that seemed non-instinctive to most Americans. out of raw security concerns. That the new definition of security would actually have you protecting the individual's privacy, as opposed to allowing the government to do something which was for a good purpose, but would make everyone in the country's digital security worse off than it would otherwise be.
You didn't respond to one particular question I'd asked you, that do you think that US could have done more in terms of allowing access, lawful access to data, and certainly for certain geographies that they believe to be allies, friends, partners, etc.
In order to undercut the argument that data should be localized because the Americans are more dangerous than anyone else, we're not. Actually, we're probably more constrained than anyone else, but that argument was a very useful one to be made when the real purpose was to enable local industries competing against American companies.
Thank you, General Layton. Argo, General has explained quite clearly what the drivers, at least from sitting where he does, are for devising any arrangement to manage this particular key question. While with the committee, and of course now you're out, the committee's job is over, what were our drivers? Were we seeking better law enforcement frameworks? Were we trying to have better governance and efficiency and the big state acting more effectively? Were we seeking to protect the individual privacy and rights? What were the key drivers for the debate while you were in that committee?
When a country like India comes in at this stage and thinks about privacy, personal interest and the collective good, I think there are three things to note. The first is that these are not binaries. Privacy, national security, innovation, these are not binaries. We have always found a way to do these things without compromising on each other. We have to find that balance in our case. And I think the way in which this balance is found, as in has in history taken a threefold path. The first is what I would call as in the bolting of the horses, which is as in the with the digital ecosystem, the states generally allowed private players to innovate. And this was primarily the United States with a laissez-faire economy, which became the default norm for the rest of the world. We didn't have a data protection law. We still don't have a data protection law in the country today. So with a few exceptions here or there, and that was phase one, when the horses were bolting. Continuing with that equine analogy, as in phase two was reining them in, and I think you do see a bit of that happening currently, whereas in India, where you see that when there's an incident of lynching, as in you first say, let's look at intermediary liability rules, so you do see some kind of efforts by states to pull back the power. And I think we are heading to a third stage where the state realizes that we have to come to a steady gallop. And that's essentially where the state and the private sector must work together.
Since you are now, the committee's job is over, and now you are, like me, a commentator on the bill, do you think we have done better in terms of holding the fiduciary aspect of the private sector than of the state itself? Because state as a data owner, have we treated at par with how we would treat a private sector in this particular bill?
So I think we need to know where we came from. As in today, as is the law today, the reasonable security practices rules don't apply to the state at all. So there are no data protection obligations on the state whatsoever today. From that, I think we have taken a quantum leap to say that the law applies to everybody, but applies differently.
Applies differently, but applies to everybody. So that's a step forward, not necessarily the ideal state where you would want it to be. And I'm putting words in your mouth. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, sir, I think this brings that nicely to you, the motivations, the drivers, and do you think that this document has achieved the fundamental objectives of what the courts wanted, what the government wanted, and what the people wanted?
We need a disciplining effect. How anybody includes government at all levels, collects data, treats it, and processes it, stores it, disposes it. Now, this is a very, very earth-shaking step in that direction, because so far there's been nothing. So in that case, one of the prospective violators of privacy being government, that at least will have a correcting effect. And all the other, it will also bring in a disciplining effect into the rest of the whole ecosystem, maybe big companies and small players and etc. So in which case, it's going to be a drastic change. The draft also proposes a year's time for everything to fall into place. There has to be a change in the way people perceive data. not necessarily, as that's why I think I would stress upon the fiduciary.
Okay.
So anybody, including government as a fiduciary, they got to treat it with responsibility and be accountable. That's the bottom line.
So let me ask you to delve a little deeper on this new responsibility the government assumes on itself, for itself. What happens at the federal level? When we federate this responsibility, the largest amount of data that is going to be produced in the near future will be not in English and will probably come from peri-urban and rural areas, the new data sets that are being created. What is the capacity of a DPA that has been envisaged and this architecture that is being implemented to actually serve that constituency of users and data wells or data owners?
Yeah, it's evolving, but what I wish to say is today if somebody is a prospective violator of privacy, there's nothing in place, where can you go and complain? So once you have a DPA, it will bring in a structure. Now, whether it needs to be at the district level or a state level or a federal level is a matter which can be resolved.